The files were not meant to be seen. Dust-covered boxes stamped with fading ink. Seal codes from the Reich main security office. Redacted margins blackened by Allied intelligence sensors. And still, against every effort to bury them, fragments survived. Lists of names, intercepted communications, coded directives signed by men who vanished into post-war obscurity. These documents form a story the victors never wanted told. A story of human trials beneath stone chambers, forbidden pacts between sworn enemies, erased massacres at the edge of empires, and hidden bioweapon harvests stolen from the corpses of civilians. These pages were never included in official histories. They were too destabilizing, too incriminating, too dark. They are fragments of 4 forbidden files, scattered across forgotten archives in Munich, Constanza, Verona, and Khabarovsk. Each one, once assembled, paints a picture of the war not as we were taught, but as it was conducted in secrecy, desperate, merciless, and complicit across borders. What you are about to hear has been reconstructed from classified reports, intercepted telegrams, missing trial transcripts, and testimony concealed for decades. These are not myths. They are the suppressed machinery of the Second World War, still echoing in silence, still haunting the edges of history. Chapter 1. Classified Human Trials Beneath Dachau Walls. The official narrative of Dachau, one of the Reich's first concentration camps, has long focused on its role as a site of political imprisonment, slave labor, and brutality. Yet buried deep in Bavarian archives, in folders marked with faded SS runes and the stamp Geheime Reichssache, top secret, lies a record of horrors long concealed. These were not the widely publicized experiments of freezing tanks or high-altitude chambers already condemned at Nuremberg. These were operations deliberately shielded, erased from testimony, and shared quietly with both Washington and Moscow. The surviving fragments bear the chilling code name Project Nachtwinde, or Project Nightwinds, a name absent from post-war prosecutions. The documents describe underground chambers beneath the stone barracks of Dachau, where airless corridors led to sealed steel rooms reinforced with riveted doors. They were not gas chambers in the conventional sense, but controlled exposure chambers used to test the lethality of newly developed nerve agents. Tabun, a compound first synthesized by German chemist Gerhard Schrader in 1936, appears repeatedly in surviving test logs. The files record dosages measured in milligrams, exposure times down to the second, and outcomes described in detached clinical terms. Respiratory collapse at 104 seconds, pupillary contraction irreversible, total motor failure. The victims were Soviet prisoners of war, identified only by initials, birth year, and prisoner numbers. A separate section of the files references Ziviltestgruppe Ost, or Civilian Test Group East, a euphemism. Historians believe points to abducted civilians. From Poland and Ukraine, the reports bear signatures, not of obscure doctors, but of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, chief of personal staff to Himmler and head physicians affiliated with Bayer and IG Farben. These corporations, later absorbed and sanitized into post-war Western industries, were present at the very heart of these trials. Their representatives, according to fragments of correspondence, attended at least 3 sessions of exposure testing, cloaked as sanitary research. The goal was clear: to determine dosage levels required for battlefield deployment, to refine protective gear, and to develop antidotes. Records show that atropine injections were administered in some cases, but always delayed, so that scientists could measure the precise moment when treatment shifted from potential recovery to irreversible death. Perhaps most disturbing is a series of marginal notes found on the edges of test logs, written in the hand of an unidentified observer, signed only with the initials KH. These notes remark on the quiet efficiency of the test method and speculate about potential application in urban combat scenarios. The handwriting analysis later conducted by Allied investigators suggested a chilling possibility. These notes may have belonged to Kurt Hirt, a chemist later recruited by Soviet forces after the war. When Allied troops liberated Dachau in April 1945, the official reports presented to journalists and the public documented medical atrocities. Yes, but carefully omitted the existence of the sealed underground chambers. The liberating forces did not wish to draw attention to discoveries that they themselves wished to exploit. The US Army's Chemical Warfare Service quietly confiscated crates of documents and transferred them first to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Within weeks, scientists who had authored the reports were interrogated and then selectively shielded from prosecution under Operation Paperclip. Soviet forces, meanwhile, raided parallel facilities in the east, desperate to obtain their own share of German chemical expertise. The testimonies that did surface came not from tribunals, but from whispers recorded in post-war interviews with Dachau survivors. They spoke of fellow prisoners taken at night, led down stairwells beneath the camp infirmary, never to return. The corridors, they said, echoed with metallic clangs and muffled coughing, then fell silent. Yet these accounts were dismissed at the time as confusion with gas chamber executions. The sealed US Army files tell another story. Each test was logged, timed and measured with scientific precision, under the watchful eyes of doctors wearing the insignia of the Reich Main Security Office. Years later, in declassified CIA memoranda from the 1950s, references appear to Nightwind's protocols, suggesting that American researchers had direct access to these Dachau records. In one memo, a field officer writes that the German methodology offers baseline efficiency superior to Soviet field tests. These lines are buried in files concerning early Cold War nerve agent research, where both superpowers raced to weaponize chemical warfare under the shadow of nuclear deterrence. It was easier, far easier, to use Nazi data than to admit that their methods had originated in crimes against humanity. Today, walking through Dachau, visitors encounter reconstructed barracks, solemn memorials, and the preserved crematorium. The underground rooms are sealed, their entrances bricked over in the early 1950s. No official plaques reference Project Nightwinds. Yet in the silent archives of Munich, the surviving pages speak plainly. Exposure times, test groups, signatures, outcomes. A crime deliberately buried not only by the perpetrators, but by those who inherited their data and cloaked it as national security. The stone walls beneath Dachau may still hold secrets, locked away from daylight, but the fragments we now possess make one truth unavoidable. What was tested there was not only the limits of human resistance, but the limits of humanity itself. This file remains incomplete. Pages are missing, redacted, or chemically erased, and still, enough survives to mark a chilling fact. Beneath Dachau, the Reich turned prisoners into instruments of science, and the victors turned their silence into policy. Chapter 2: Forbidden Pact Beneath the Black Sea. The official history of late summer 1944 tells of collapse. Romania breaking with Hitler, the Red Army pushing across the Carpathians, and German forces retreating in chaos. Yet within the classified corridors of Moscow's archives and in forgotten cipher intercepts from Bletchley Park, a different narrative appears, a story of a secret pact signed in shadow, far from the eyes of the world. It was known by its code name, Abkommen Nebel, the Agreement Fog. The title was fitting, for it emerged in mist, lingered in uncertainty, and then was deliberately erased. The documents now resurfaced reveal the most unsettling truth of all. Sworn enemies found common ground, if only for a few weeks, beneath the waves of the Black Sea. The story begins in the Romanian port city of Constanța, a strategic lifeline for petroleum exports and naval resupply. The date was August 18th, 1944. Less than a week later, King Michael would stage his dramatic coup, overthrowing Marshal Ion Antonescu and declaring war against Germany. But before that rupture, senior Wehrmacht naval officers, accompanied by representatives of the SS, arrived secretly in Constanța under cover of a supply inspection. Soviet liaisons, believed to be from the NKVD's Section 4 of Naval Intelligence, met them in a candlelit warehouse near the docks. The surviving Soviet memorandum, unearthed in the 1990s, references the gathering obliquely. Provisional understanding reached, U-boat access permitted under neutral observation, petroleum commitments secured. It bears no signatures, only initials, K and V. Historians debate who these figures were, but the suspicion has always fallen on Konstantin Vershinin, a Soviet naval attaché, and a German counterpart believed to be Korvettenkapitän Ernst Kals, commander of U-23 in the Black Sea flotilla. The Pact's core terms were simple but staggering. German U-boats would be permitted temporary refueling access at isolated points along the Black Sea coast, in return for ensuring that Soviet forces could secure petroleum shipments from Ploiești without sabotage. In other words, while Berlin and Moscow publicly fought to the death, their representatives quietly agreed to carve out a corridor of survival. The agreement was short-lived. a bridge of convenience across a river of blood. And yet, for the men who signed it, it promised a chance to preserve what mattered most: fuel and survival. British decrypts from Bletchley Park, however, suggest that London knew of the pact almost as soon as it was formed. A fragment of ultra-intelligence, declassified only in the late 1970s, contains references to unusual traffic between Constanza and Odessa. A naval officer scribbled in the margin, possibly evidence of a Soviet-German truce, yet no action was taken. No public revelation, for Churchill and his war cabinet, exposing this forbidden collaboration, risked unraveling the fragile alliance with Stalin, just as the Western Allies prepared for the final push into Germany. The calculus was cold and pragmatic. Let the secret stand for now, and let it die unspoken in archives. Better to preserve unity in victory than reveal the duplicity of allies. On the ground, however, the consequences were horrific. Villages near the petroleum transport routes were targeted for clearance operations. Entire communities were labelled partisan sympathizers by German security divisions, while Soviet detachments stood by, ensuring that the supply corridors remained intact. Survivors recalled sudden nighttime evacuations, livestock seized, homes torched. Yet official post-war records in Bucharest presented these burnings as battle damage. The truth, preserved only in fragmented Soviet and German reports, is that the people were sacrificed not in war, but in silence, to safeguard an agreement both sides intended to deny. By August 23rd, the entire arrangement collapsed. King Michael's coup forced Romania into the Allied camp. German officers fled Constanza under fire. Soviet troops seized the port outright. The pact was never renewed, yet the traces remained in half-burnt communiques, in naval logbooks with missing pages, and in the private diaries of Romanian intermediaries who never survived the subsequent purges. For the Western Allies, it was a truth too poisonous to admit. If the public had learned that Stalin's agents negotiated with Nazi officers, even as Allied soldiers bled on the beaches of Normandy, faith in the wartime alliance might have fractured irreparably. The decision was simple. The files were locked, labelled politically sensitive, and left to rot. It would take decades for fragments to resurface. In the 1960s, during a brief thaw in Soviet censorship, a naval historian in Odessa stumbled across references to fog agreement in NKVD logistics reports. He was silenced, dismissed from his post, and the reference struck from official publications. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, researchers in Moscow discovered memoranda stamped with the initials of Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's feared secret police chief, who had personally reviewed the Constanza meeting report. His marginalia read only, "temporarily acceptable." Ensure silence after collapse. What emerges from these scraps is not a complete narrative, but a chilling mosaic. Two enemies locked in a war of annihilation willing, for a fleeting moment, to set aside ideology for fuel. The Black Sea Pact did not last. It could not last. But its existence shatters the myth of absolute enmity. War, in its darkest recesses, was a negotiation as much as it was a battlefield, and the civilians who lived along the transport routes paid with their homes, their lives, and their silence. Today, Constanza is a bustling Romanian port, its history layered in monuments to liberation. Yet beneath the surface, in the erased paragraphs of wartime communiques, lingers the shadow of a forbidden pact, one that proves how far desperation could bend ideology, and how easily truth could be buried under the fog of victory. Chapter 3: Erased Massacre of Operation Springwind. In the waning months of the Second World War, as the Reich crumbled and Allied troops surged from every front, the remnants of the Waffen-SS were tasked with impossible orders. Hold ground they could no longer defend, suppress resistance movements that were already flourishing, and retreat through landscapes that had turned openly hostile. In northern Italy, the collapse of fascist authority left valleys and mountain villages under partisan control. For Heinrich Himmler, this was intolerable. The Italian front was to be cleansed of resistance before the Wehrmacht fell back to Germany. To execute this order, Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, already infamous for brutality on the Eastern Front and in France, was dispatched with elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. His mission bore the codename Operation Frühling's Wind, or Springwind. The sanitized record presented to military tribunals later described it as a counter-insurgency maneuver. The declassified fragments tell another story. An eradication campaign directed not only at fighters, but at the civilian populations who harbored them. The first reports emerged from Verona, where Allied interrogators in 1946 interviewed Italian witnesses. Their accounts spoke of entire villages encircled at dawn, homes set alight, livestock slaughtered, and inhabitants marched at gunpoint into alpine caves. Once inside, grenades were thrown, and the entrances sealed with rubble. Children and the elderly were not spared. A priest in the village of Malga described in his deposition, preserved in US counterintelligence corps files, screams muffled beneath stone, then only silence and smoke. Yet this deposition never appeared at Nuremberg. It was marked restricted for intelligence use only, filed into cabinets under CIC Report 12-117 IT, and forgotten. The missing tribunal record can be traced to a convergence of political necessity and Cold War pragmatism. Italy, newly liberated and politically unstable, was being courted by Washington to join the Western Bloc. A fragile government in Rome sought NATO protection, while the US needed bases in the Mediterranean to counter Soviet influence. To expose atrocities on Italian soil, atrocities carried out by SS units that Washington would soon rely upon for intelligence on the Eastern Bloc, risked destabilizing the very order they were building. Thus names were redacted, reports sealed, and testimonies dismissed as unverified. Piper himself, though tried for war crimes in relation to the Malmedy massacre in Belgium, faced no charges for the crimes of Operation Springwind. Fragments of the operation reappear in contradictory German field logs. A surviving document from March 1945 lists Bergregion cleared, 417 hostiles neutralized. Yet cross-referencing this with village census data shows that the numbers correspond not to combatants, but to the entire populations of hamlets scattered along the Trentino valleys. Women in their 70s, infants, whole families. A handwritten annotation in the margin, likely from an SS adjutant, notes orders executed in full accordance with Kommandobefehl. This infamous directive from Himmler demanded that captured partisans be executed without trial and that civilians suspected of collaboration face collective measures. Operation Springwind was its brutal fulfillment. The erasure of the massacre extended beyond tribunals. In the 1950s, as NATO expanded, Italian government reports on wartime atrocities were quietly edited. Documents collected by the Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale, the National Liberation Committee, were locked in cabinets at the Ministry of Defense under the infamous Armadio della Vergogna, the Cabinet of Shame. Behind its sealed wooden doors lay thousands of files on German war crimes in Italy, including evidence of Springwind. They remained untouched for decades, deliberately hidden from prosecutors, until by chance they were rediscovered in 1994 by a military prosecutor investigating unrelated cases. The files revealed that Allied intelligence had long known of massacres carried out by Piper's unit, but suppressed them for diplomatic reasons. What survives of the survivors' voices is sparse but haunting. In 1947, an Italian farmer named Vittorio L., whose deposition was never published, described watching his village burned from the hills. The sky glowed red, and the smoke carried the cries of children. We could not go down. The Germans shot anyone who moved. Another survivor, an elderly woman, recalled being forced to walk past the sealed caves days later. The stones were still warm. We prayed, but no one answered. These testimonies remained buried in archives, sealed by bureaucratic indifference and political convenience. Piper's fate is its own grim irony. After serving a prison sentence for the Malmedy massacre, he was released in 1956 and lived quietly in West Germany, working as a translator for automobile companies. To his neighbors, he was simply another veteran rebuilding his life. Few knew of the orders he had carried out in northern Italy, of the villages he erased, or of the silence that had protected him. In 1976, Piper was assassinated at his home in Travers, France, his house set ablaze by unknown assailants. Officially, the motive was revenge by leftist militants, but among the classified files lies a darker speculation that his death silenced a man who carried too many secrets. Today, the valleys of Trentino and Alto Adige bear no plaques for Springwind. Local oral histories preserve fragments, grandparents speaking of the fire days, of German soldiers who came with dogs and torches. But without official recognition, the memory fades. It is as if the massacre never happened, erased first by the perpetrators, then by the victors who chose to forget. Yet in the locked cabinets, in the half-burned files, the truth waits. Operation Springwind was not a battle, but a cleansing. It was the calculated extermination of civilians to clear a retreating army's path. And it was deliberately hidden, for to admit it would have implicated not only the Reich, but the Western powers who allowed silence to serve as currency in the new Cold War order. The erasure of Springwind is a reminder of how fragile memory can be when weighed against political necessity. The dead remain in their sealed caves, their stories buried in locked cabinets. Only the scattered pages and whispered testimonies allow us to reconstruct the crime. And what they reveal is not only the brutality of the SS, but the complicity of silence. Operation Springwind was not forgotten. It was erased, and that erasure was itself a crime. Chapter 4: Hidden Soviet Bioweapon Harvest in Manchuria. In August 1945, as the atomic fires consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another horror unfolded far from the public eye. The Red Army, advancing with overwhelming force into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, swept aside the remnants of the Kwantung Army and seized the sprawling complex at Pingfang, near Harbin. To the world, this was the collapse of Japan's last stronghold on the Asian mainland. To those who saw the inside of the laboratories, it was something else entirely. The unveiling of Unit 731's vast human experimentation program. Yet the true scandal was not only the discovery of these crimes, but what followed. For instead of dismantling the horror, Soviet intelligence harvested it. Men, materials, and pathogens, transforming atrocity into research. This secret would remain locked away for decades, shielded by the Cold War's Iron Curtain. The Pingfang facility was vast, a self-contained city of death. Its perimeter walls stretched nearly 3 square kilometers. Within stood barracks, laboratories, operating theaters, and crematoria. Japanese doctors, under the command of General Shiro Ishii, had used it to test biological warfare agents on thousands of living subjects. Plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax. Testimonies later described prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean conscripts, captured Soviet soldiers, even Allied POWs, strapped to wooden crosses in open fields, exposed deliberately to bombs laced with bacteria. Entire villages downstream were poisoned when wells were seeded with cholera cultures. The evidence was undeniable, and the Soviets knew it. But instead of destroying the facility outright, they looted it systematically, cataloging equipment and seizing live cultures. A Soviet report declassified in the 1990s describes transport of refrigerated specimens and experimental records to Khabarovsk laboratories under guard of SMERSH units. The Soviets were not alone in this calculus. Across the Pacific, American intelligence was engaged in its own negotiations with Japanese scientists. While Moscow prepared the Khabarovsk trials in 1949, Washington cut its own deal, granting Shiro Ishii and his senior staff immunity in exchange for exclusive access to their data. What emerged was a grotesque symmetry. The victors of the Second World War, enemies in the Cold War, both exploiting the same crimes to fuel their own bioweapons programs. The victims, nameless and voiceless, were reduced to experimental material in classified reports. Soviet files detail how captured Unit 731 officers were interrogated and compelled to continue their work under new masters. In the Siberian city of Sverdlovsk, laboratories began testing aerosolized plague strains. One Soviet memorandum, stamped Osobaya Papka, or special file, describes successful trials of delivery mechanisms utilizing ceramic bomblets. This chilling phrase directly echoed Japanese designs recovered from Pingfang. Witnesses later claimed that some of the test material used in these trials were the very prisoners transferred from Manchuria, civilians and POWs taken alongside the equipment. None of them survived. At the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949, the Soviets staged a public reckoning of sorts. 12 Japanese defendants, including Major General Kiyoshi Kawashima, confessed in detail to biological experiments. Yet these confessions, though shocking, were carefully curated. The tribunal transcripts emphasized Japanese guilt, but omitted entirely the fact that the Soviet Union had absorbed both the data and the scientists into its own military medical institutes. Western observers at the time dismissed the trials as propaganda, never realizing how much truth lay beneath the staged theatrics. For decades, references to Pingfang in Soviet documents remained buried in special archives, accessible only to the highest officials. the consequences of this harvest were not merely academic. In the early 1950s, during the Korean War, American pilots captured by Chinese forces reported being accused of deploying biological weapons, claims dismissed in the West as communist propaganda. Yet behind closed doors, US intelligence officers debated whether the accusations reflected Soviet testing of their newly acquired Japanese strains. A CIA memo from 1952, declassified only in the 1990s, noted reports of unusual disease outbreaks in Korean battle zones, consistent with aerosolized dissemination. The memo concluded cautiously, possible exploitation of former Japanese biowarfare material by Soviet or Chinese allies cannot be excluded. For survivors in Manchuria, the silence was total. Villages that had been seeded with plague or cholera were erased from maps. Families who lost generations to disease outbreaks were told nothing. Only in the late 1980s, as Soviet control weakened, did fragments of testimony begin to surface. Elderly residents recalled soldiers in protective masks digging wells, only to vanish days later in mass burials. Others described freight trains leaving Pingfang at night, guarded by Soviet troops, bound north toward Harbin and beyond. No one knew what they carried. Only later did declassified reports confirm pathogens, equipment, and captured Japanese medical officers. The ethical betrayal ran deeper still. In 1989, researchers uncovered correspondence between Soviet military doctors and their American counterparts from the early Cold War. Both sides had compared notes, indirectly through academic conferences, on disease resistance, immunization studies, and delivery methods. Neither side ever admitted that the roots of their data lay in the frozen corpses of Manchurian test subjects. The victims of Unit 731 were erased twice, first by their executioners, then by the governments who inherited their suffering. Today, the ruins of Pingfang are preserved as a museum. Visitors walk through cracked walls and rusted iron doors, peering into glass cases of surgical tools and shackles. Yet even here, the Soviet chapter of the story remains muted. The displays condemn Japanese atrocities, but they do not speak of the refrigerated trains bound for Khabarovsk, or the laboratories in Sverdlovsk, where echoes of those crimes continued. The full story lies not in public memorials, but in the declassified files of two superpowers, each of which chose to exploit human suffering in pursuit of military supremacy. The hidden harvest of Manchuria stands as one of the darkest legacies of the Second World War. It is a story not only of atrocity, but of appropriation, where evidence of crimes was not destroyed but weaponized. And the silence that followed was not ignorance, but policy. The Red Army's capture of Pingfang was not liberation, it was acquisition, and in that acquisition, the victims of Unit 731 were consigned to oblivion, their agony transmuted into classified data, sealed for decades behind iron doors. The file's close, but the silence remains. 4 fragments, torn from archives across continents, speak of truths long concealed. Human beings reduced to test material beneath Dachau's stone walls, enemies conspiring in shadow at Constanza's port, alpine villages erased from maps under the name of Springwind, and plague harvested from the corpses of Manchuria. None of these events survived in official histories as they occurred. They were hidden, diluted, or rewritten, not because the evidence was absent, but because the truth was too costly. What unites them is not only the brutality of the perpetrators, but the complicity of those who followed, who inherited the crimes and chose silence over revelation. Even now, many files remain sealed, their pages blackened with redactions, their margins scarred with missing names. Perhaps the most disturbing thought is not what has been uncovered, but what still lies buried, in cabinets of shame, in sealed Cold War archives, in the bricked corridors of forgotten camps. These secrets, once forbidden, remind us of the shadows that linger behind official memory. And they leave us with a haunting question. If these 4 fragments surfaced, how many others remain hidden, waiting in silence for the day their seals are finally broken?